folks, welcome to Last Breath Woodworks. I'm Josh. Now in this video, I'm going to be trying a couple new things, or at least new to me. First, I'm going to be using spalted maple, which I've never worked with before, and second, I'm going to be attempting to make an oversized yarn bowl for my daughter. Now I just started out by using the chainsaw to cut that chunk of firewood in half lengthwise, and then made a template out of some scrap plywood that was the same size as the bottom of my casting bucket to cut these pieces out on the bandsaw. As you can see, there was a lot of beautiful spalting in there, and even a lot of really nice, kind of like crotch-like grain from those knots on each piece. And I just took a abrasive wheel on my die grinder to kind of scrape away all that mold, mildew, little slivers of bark that were left, and any little punk areas. Now they were still a little bit wet inside, so I threw them in a 300-degree oven for about an hour, let them cool down completely, and as I expected, there were some cracks, but I didn't mind. I'm putting epoxy in this thing anyway, so it might give a little bit of detail. Then I just used my center finder to mark the middle of each half, then drill the hole, and then inserted a small piece of just a bamboo skewer to line the two up. Then I just added a good amount of CA glue to that skewer and coupled the two together and kind of just spun it around and lined them up until I had a nice even or appealing gap between those two pieces all the way around for the epoxy to show. Once the pieces were in the bucket, I just wrapped the piece of scrap wood with some packing tape so it would pop out of the mold later, and then used some Gorilla Tape to hold everything in place so that those maple chunks wouldn't float up when the epoxy was added. And here's where you can see my first major mistake. Look at the gap around that top piece. When I cut those rounds out of the maple blanks, I forgot to take into account the taper in the sides of the bucket. And now I've got a lot of space to fill that's going to waste a lot of epoxy. So I had to come up with something quick, and since my daughter's a pastaholic, you guessed it, we're going to add some pasta. I had some bow tie pasta just sitting in the pantry in the house, so I thought I'd give it a shot. And I know what everybody's thinking. I should have learned my lesson after playing around with those pistachio shells, but I guess I'm just too stubborn. So I just started pouring them in and carefully shaking and banging the bucket because I didn't want to break them, just wanted to fill it. And the whole time I was doing it, the only thing I could think of was That's gonna make a nice bowl, eh? But seriously, I mean, I had to do something to take up that space so that I didn't waste more epoxy than I needed to. Now, ever since my older daughter was a little girl, her favorite color was blue, so that's what I went with on this one. But I did add just a little bit of violet pearl to make it a little more feminine. Now that the epoxy was in the mold, I'm sure a few of you are getting a little tired of seeing the vacuum chamber, but I thought it was a little bit important that I show it again for any new viewers, because air dry or pressure pot alone was not going to cut it on this project. With the cracks in those maple blanks and all the air gaps around that pasta, this was a necessary step to suck all the air out of that piece. Once I was sure that I had everything out, I dropped it in the pressure pot, topped it off, and was feeling pretty confident. But after 3 days, I opened it up, and that spalted maple must have been punkier than I thought, because it sucked up about 80% of the epoxy. So I had to do a second pour and seal it up for another 3 or 4 days. Once I popped this piece out of the mold and got it on the lathe, I was thrilled that there were no thermal cracks or air bubbles, but you can see there were some lines where my 2 pours came together. However, when you see how thick that epoxy and pasta was on the outside, a lot of that's going to disappear by the time I get it back down to the wood. So I just started whittling away and getting this thing rounded out and into shape. And here you can see, and I'm getting there, but there's a couple small visible cracks and a little bit of ghosting, a couple little pieces of tear out, some chips in the epoxy, but I had a ways to go, so I was pretty confident those were going to disappear. Now, when it came to shaping this piece, I really wanted to go a lot smaller with the profile and cut that base or neck for that pedestal in a lot deeper, but the wood told me no. I mean, you got to let it speak to you, and it said no. I mean, when I got to this point, the amount of grain and spalting that were visible were just too beautiful to try to cut away any further. I might lose it all. So I just went with it and kind of gave it the shape that it wanted me to. And when I got there, I just sanded the whole piece down from 80 to 220. I also added a pretty heavy concave in the base of this piece, inside that foot, because I didn't want this thing tipping over when you're trying to pull yarn out of it. I mean, it's going to have some stress tugging at it from the side, so it was all kind of part of the plan. Then I just used a Forstner bit to cut a really oversized mortise into the bottom of this thing, and we'll get to the reason for that in a little bit. Once I had it flipped over, it was just time to hollow this thing out, and to be honest, it went pretty smoothly. I mean, this thing carved out really nice. I don't know if it was just because that spalted wood was softer, or I didn't have a lot of hard materials in there to get in the way, but it carved out nice. And I went for a really round shape on the inside, almost like you cut a ball in half. I wanted it really rounded so that the yarn ball would spin freely inside. Once I had everything shaped and sanded, I gave it a couple coats of some heavy epoxy here because that spalted wood was still sucking up everything it could get. Once it dried, I sanded that down to 800, and then I made a template out of some painter's tape and carved a rough shape of what I wanted the yarn slot to be, and then just traced that out onto the side of the bowl, making sure I did it on the side grain and not the end grain to give it a little extra strength. Then I just drilled a hole in the middle of it to give myself a place to start with the Dremel to carve it all out. Once I took this piece out of the chuck, I was actually amazed at how light it was, but I kind of anticipated that, and that was the reason for that very deep mortise. I just poured a little epoxy in the bottom of it, added some shotgun pellets, and then smoothed them out, added some more epoxy over the top to totally encapsulate it and seal it all off. Then once that cured, all I had to do was give it a couple coats of lacquer to seal everything up tight and give it a nice shine. Well, folks, it's done. It's definitely got some heft to it now with that weight in the bottom, but got some beautiful spalting. At first, I wasn't happy about how some of the colors got darkened, but I think it actually adds kind of a cool yin-yang effect. You can really see how it characterized there. And the pasta, the different shapes of the pasta and the epoxy. And there's the yarn, the string cutout, whatever you want to call it. I ended up deleting a lot of the footage of that. It was quite a battle. I was only using an old Dremel with a spiral cutting bit, and it probably took me a good 2 hours just to carve that out. And it did come out okay. I mean, I was going for the shape of a C. My daughter's name is Chloe, so I thought it was appropriate. So that came out good. Nice smooth finish on the inside, so yarn ball twirl around. But as always, I'll put up the glamour shots at the end, and thanks for watching Last Breath Woodworks.